Hello, Dr. Clement.
Good morning.
Let me see how. Good morning. How are you doing?
I'm doing great.
Okay, well, we're right here. Let's say hello, Dr. Clement. Yeah, so let me, gentlemen, thank you very much, Dr. Clement, for joining us in this very early morning session. And let me briefly introduce Dr. Clement, who he is, what he has done, and also his recent book. It's called "It's All About Work" and was issued last year, available on Amazon. So Dr. Clement is a military officer, has served this country since the Vietnam War. Met General Depew, and with Dr. Clement, we talked about General Depew and what it means to being deputed here in the in the within the context of this class. So Dr. Clement served in the military, and then what he did, completed his PhD, and has been working on organizational design for the past 40 or 50 years in the military or with large multinational companies in the United States and worldwide. And has been traveling all over the world conducting his organizational studies, and that's how we have met. We're working with the same methods and in the Pentagon. For Dr. Clement, by the way, and those of you who are military folks, it's good afternoon because usually the work begins at 4 a.m. and now it's a lunchtime. Some of the books that we have used in this class, actually, when I worked with Dr. Clement in the Pentagon on the psychology of military incompetence, was one of the books recommended by Dr. Clement. And he has worked extensively with Elliot Jacks and with a lot of other people. Some of you are working on VA. How many of you are working with VA? So the VA concepts are not foreign to Dr. Clement, and so I've asked him to come in. We've covered all of the concepts of time span. I've asked you to read Dr. Clement's paper on time span and time compression. And so I've asked you to come in. This is the class consists of mid to senior to rising executives, and they'll be changing the world, Dr. Clement, in the next 20 to 30 years. And I've asked you to come up with questions that are at the forefront at our nation, that our organizations face, and talk a little bit about himself, and hopefully give you the answers that at least will put either they'll answer the questions or send you on a path to finding the answers that I think as a leader or as our national leader, organizational leader, you need. With that, Dr. Clement, welcome to the class, and thank you again for joining.
Okay, good. I'm ready for questions. So this is the next generation of leaders. Okay, I'm ready.
Is here, and the person who is who will be the first one. Go ahead, sir.
I guess I volunteered. Who's next?
That's called the hot seat.
It is the hot seat. This is where I normally sit. So, in reading your paper, I noticed that some of the things that you referred to in time compression, and especially with Sergey stuff, kind of resonated with me. But the very first thing that I took away from it was in one of our first sessions, Sergey talked a little bit about Frederick Taylor. And to me, it seems like, and I'm just going to be very straightforward about it, you guys are wrong, and that it's more akin to Taylor's stone soldiering, and that they're not doing the right work stateside as opposed to time compression. What do you think of that?
Okay, so you think they're not doing the right work in the first place, and that it's not a time compression issue. That's an interesting observation. Taylor broke work down into its smallest discrete elements and assigned it out to people. And then that led to the whole notion. But why do you think it's not time compression? For example, in a wartime situation, do you really believe that the senior general is going to have a 10-year perspective? He might, in terms of where the country might be going, but he's really worried more about shorter-term issues. The more I think about it, the more I think there's three kinds of time: normal time, fast time, and then a third time, and I'm not quite sure. And I think situations vary in terms of those. And we're looking for the data that would support that. How about IT? Do you think IT is in a the whole notion of the IT world is in normal time, or is it in a more compressed or faster time?
I think the thing that, in my opinion, actually drives a lot of that is not necessarily the time, but the information that's available now, especially to IT professionals, and more specifically in our enabled environments with every type of data that we have available, devices and things like that readily at hand. In the old days, for example, back before the Civil War and things like that, it took weeks or months for news to travel from place to place. Now that stuff is instantaneously available from people that are embedded in the units as our units go to war and stuff, to an IT professional who's sitting at his table and knows exactly what's down, what's happening, and where it's happening across his organization. So I think that's more a product of the information that's available to him rather than the time span.
Okay. Let's take that thought one step further. Then, has that not made the job of the individual more complex because they have more access to more information and it's changing more rapidly? Take the company commander now, who has, in wartime, he has access to much more information than he ever did in the past. Isn't that a more complex role than it was in the past?
I think the base role is still the same. I don't know that the role changes as much. I mean, if you go back to the time compression paper that you guys were talking about a minute ago, while they're looking at 10, 15, 20 years, when they're sitting stateside and stuff, I think the work is scoped wrong because back here in the States, it's easy to not be motivated by fear. When you're there in the war theater and you're actually front to front with the enemy, it's minute by minute, second by second kind of decisions that you're making. So again, I think it's the information that's available and the decisions that you're making, not the time span that's necessarily compressed.
Okay, interesting comment. All right, I'll think about that some more. Anybody else want to comment on that?
Questions? Yes, come on up. Come on up on the hot seat.
Anybody? I can go again.
Yes, it's Hindra, come on up. And then the second person who is coming, who is next? By the way, I give extra credit for questions, and I give extra paper for those who don't ask a question. Paper 4, 25-page, single-spaced.
Good morning, Dr. Clement.
Morning.
My questions are, or at least I'll start with one. How does the time span or compression apply for startups or startup companies in the IT world?
Well, I think startup companies have to first they have to survive. They have to be able to get their product to market and be able to penetrate a particular market segment and do that in a very rapid fashion so that they can survive. Whether you want to call that time span or time compression, and incidentally, I don't use the time span measurement very much. I simply look at the work and say, okay, it's very urgent. So to me, a startup has to survive and get things moving very rapidly. So they have to be very agile and very quick on the response. Anything else? Any comments?
Well, I think I just wanted to find or look at your observations or comments on how that would compare with some of the large multinational or the federal government organizations.
Well, let's take two examples. Rio Tinto, big mining company, one of the original companies that Elliott studied. Typical mine it's about a $2 billion investment, and you're guesstimating that you're going to get a 20-year return on the mine itself to pay back your investment. And so it's a guess because you don't know what the ore body looks like when you do that. But that's a fairly stable environment because the ore bodies aren't changing that rapidly. Now contrast that with let's take the government. Most of the government agencies run on the 5 + 2 7-year budget cycle in terms of the money. So they don't really have most of the government can't do anything different this year, certainly not this year, and they can do very little next year because the budget's pretty well spent. So they get a little bit of flexibility in the out years, but not more as they get further out. So they tend to have a longer or a perspective in terms of 5 to 7 years at the operating level. But notice that whenever the government wants to change something quickly, they need more money. They can't reprogram what they already have because they just go back and ask Congress for more money instead of saying, well, I'm going to stop doing something else. Have you ever seen the government stop doing anything? They just want you guys, they just want your generation to pay more taxes so they can spend more money on more programs and projects in terms of that. So I don't see any notion of a sunset clause on anything in the government. Everybody comes up with a new idea, and when you have a Congress that's organized around new ideas, they come up with new ideas, and so it's a never-ending battle. Not surprised that we have a continuously growing government. By the way, my solution to that would be to cut 6% of their budget every year, everybody's. Because the only way you're going to get people to change behavior is take their money away in the government side. But I'm not very popular up there with that idea of cutting.
I certainly, I guess, agree with you on that front, and I try to use that at my workplace. Whenever something new comes up, not in a, I guess, sarcastic way, but in a humorous way, I ask the question back to my executive team, saying, "What should I take away?"
Right.
When you're asking me to give this new thing, what can I take away and not support?
When I was doing work at West Point, this should resonate with you all since you're in school. They kept adding more and more courses. And the question was, which courses go away? You can't just keep adding additional courses of instruction to a student without something going away, right? And so, or you guys will work longer and longer hours or stay in school longer, which is not value added, in my opinion. So the question is, what replaces what? And how do you get rid of things? I would put a sunset clause on almost everything and force things to be reevaluated to see if we should still do it. Commercial companies do that. Sometimes you'll go out to buy a product and you'll find out the product's gone because they've decided that they don't make enough profit and they just eliminate the product. But have you ever seen anybody do that in the government? Now, did you know that the president of Purdue University recently announced that there will be no more tuition increases for students for the next 5 years? And he told the department heads, you're going to have to figure out how you're going to get by with less money. I'm not going to pass the tuition increase on to the students. Now, he was the former governor of Indiana and the former head of the budget office in Washington before he went to Indiana. Interesting approach. Okay, anything else?
I have another question. This is kind of related to one of the other papers on your on the site. It's related to the organizational design development. Can you please share some of the formal design principles that define the accountabilities associated with the key positions in the organization?
What I find generally in most organizations is the problems are at the middle and top. At the bottom, people working at the entry levels are probably doing a pretty good job if they were left alone and provided the resources. The problem is that middle managers and senior managers are all down in the weeds trying to help the subordinates do their work better when in fact all they're doing is meddling. The last fun job is level 3. In the military, that's a battalion. In industry, that's a unit director. That's the last level where if you give an order, people actually follow it and execute. Above that, anonymity sets in, and the work isn't as much fun. And so there's a natural tendency on the part of middle-level managers to continue doing what they liked and what they were very successful at, but that's not their work. The work at the middle is operational work, focused on Lean Six Sigma type things, process improvement, those kinds of issues, project work. And that's not as much fun as actually dealing with people. Work at the senior level is even more uncertain and more less pragmatic. Here you're dealing with uncertainty, and you're dealing with culture and those kinds of issues. And so what happens is that the senior people don't always do their work. I wrote a different paper, you haven't seen it, called Getting Generals to Do Generals' Work. Generals love to do colonels' work. Colonels love to do captains' work. But what the generals need to do is their own work, and CEOs need to do their own work as well. So yeah, I think I'm always looking for problems at the middle and top. I start off with the assumption the bottom is probably doing okay if they would allow them to work at their full capability. Okay, anything else?
So my question goes back to time spanning.
Okay.
So I work for the government. I work for the Department of Defense, right? So I definitely saw a lot of truth in what you wrote about time spanning. My question is, compressed time spanning. I mean, once it's been compressed, how do you decompress? Particularly if you're in an environment where half of your organization is still going downrange, fighting in a war zone, and then the other half is returning, right? How do you decompress that organization?
Yeah, that's an interesting challenge in terms of because we never had that in the past because we always committed units in total and not portions of units from the same activity. And so in the different cycle, what you've got is you've got different time horizons on the part of the commander. And so he's got to put himself in different positions in terms of, so what do you think the natural tendency is to focus on the short term and not the longer term, yes, even though they're not in the combat situation?
Of course, it's easier.
Yeah, they get pulled down in the weeds. I watched the CEO of a big company do an interesting thing. He had two chairs. He had the chair you're sitting in right now, which was his CEO chair. Then he had his time compression chair. He didn't call it that, but he had his other chair, which is his project chair. And he would move back and forth and because he said, I have to think differently in my different chairs. And he gave a talk to a number of defense people about that, and it was more than just a symbol of the two chairs. It was the notion that he had to look at the world differently from two different perspectives. And it's hard to do that from one office, the same place, the same time. You tend to get pulled into the short term as opposed to the longer term.
Very true. Very true.
And so, yeah, that's a real dilemma in terms of that's added complexity to the commander's job that it wasn't there in the past.
And then what happens is you have no strategic direction, right? You have tactical direction, operational direction, but no strategic.
Absolutely. No strategic direction. And that's the notion of being pulled down into, and those would be the people I'd say, it's time for the general to do general's work. Yeah. Get out of commanding the battalion, even though he's worried about that.
Roger that. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Good question.
Good morning.
Morning.
So my question is a little bit different since I'm a bioinformatics student. It has to do with research time phases, since time compression wouldn't really phase us. Since one example would be the Human Genome Project that took about more than 10 years to complete. Where would research fall in the whole time compression thing?
There's an interesting body of literature from your field that we did some work with when I was in the Army at the University of Louisville called Living Systems Theory. And Jim Miller, who was the president and did the work, we looked at we found, interestingly, 7 levels, just like Elliot Jacks found 7 levels, from the cell up to the supernatural organization. But one of the things was matter, energy processing, and time issues. One of our findings was it took less time to send a message to Europe. This was back in probably the early 80s. It took less time to send a message to Europe, admin message to Europe, than a flash message about a impending nuclear attack. What was interesting about that was the system on a hot message, everybody got in and interfered and read it and interpreted it. And what happened is it took much longer to get the message, critical message out. Now, that's going to be changed somewhat because modern technology allows you to communicate directly. But there's a whole interesting theory of literature that has very similar kinds of concepts in the biological sciences to some of the organizational science findings that Dr. Jacks had, which is kind of encouraging because it suggests that maybe there's some truth to these 7 levels and to this notion of how we process information, how fast and how we deal with it.
So, would you say compartmentalization would be the key here to, be more efficient, or something else?
I don't know about compartmentalizing. That's the CIA. Everything is compartmentalized and nothing is shared. And I wonder how efficient they are. They're so concerned about secrecy and compartmentalizing that they don't share things across departments, and as a result, they don't see the big picture or the pattern. They see just the data before them. So that's an interesting challenge. How do you maintain integrity of data without
Right.
but yet allow people to share it?
So it's more of like some kind of a like balancing act, you would say. Like you can have somewhat compartmentalization in there.
Yeah, I think you have to have some of that, but on the other hand, you also have to be willing to share some of that. And when you do that, it's going to get out. So you're not going to have, the perfect way to keep nothing from happening is to let nothing out.
Right. Okay.
And of course, then what happens is there'll be a crisis, and everybody will come back after the fact and say, "Why didn't you share that?" In terms of that, just look around. The other day, I was trying to get my security clearance for the VA project I'm working on, and they wouldn't take the Department of Defense security clearance that I already had. They said, "Well, we're different." And what was interesting about that is all security clearances for all government agencies go to the same FBI building in West Virginia.
Right.
So you would think that they would share that and save money and time, right? Nope.
Right. So sometimes it's not good, right?
Right. Okay.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks.
Good morning. I have a question regarding IT world. Nowadays, in IT world, most of the work it's been doing, and we are doing in offshore with offshore teams, and it's almost round the clock. We have during our communication, we have challenges such like culture, time differences, time zone differences. So work span has been increased from 8 to 16 hours, sometime more than that. On the other end, we also have different chain of commands passing through different strategic direction. So in that arena, what do you suggest for the emerging leaders? What should they do in order to better manage their teams?
I think you have to be much more flexible in terms of that. My oldest son, who used to work for me, just took over as international sales manager, and he does Skype from his home office he'll do 4 a.m., he'll do 10 a.m., and then he'll have to come back and do later. So as a manager, you have to be more flexible in terms of how you manage your workforce. You also have to empower your workers to a greater extent and trust that they're doing work even though they may not be in the house or in the office at the same time. So I think it's incumbent upon in today's global society for managers to be a bit more flexible, a bit more realistic about dealing worldwide, and also probably a bit more understanding about what people wear in terms of, so I've done Skype with people early in the morning, and I'll see them in their pajamas. And you can't get too excited about that in terms of that, because you're working in a global environment. And so I think if you're raised in a traditional hierarchical structure, you're probably going to have some trouble in that. You got to be a bit more flexible. I think your generation is probably easier making the adjustment than my generation in terms of those kinds of issues. And I think if you look at companies like Google and some of those high-tech companies, they're organized. They still have a traditional hierarchy, but they're much less structured than a lot of traditional companies.
Correct. Thank you.
Okay.
Hello, good morning.
Morning.
My question is more related to, so I do see this analysis being applied to big corporations, but how would you implement this on small businesses where most people, like even the owner and a lot of people working for that organization, are into multiple roles and are acting as different organizational level and making decision and doing daily work too?
Yeah, remember I told you I don't worry too much about the time span instrument or time horizon. If you're in a small business, if you're a mom and pop running a mom and pop grocery store, you're doing everything. You're stocking the shelves, plus you're running the cash register. So you're working at multiple levels. And the big issue is, when do you differentiate out and hire subordinates if there's enough full-time work? That's a real challenge to a small company growing, is when do you give it up and bring on a salesperson or bring on a marketing person? But you're never going to be able to, in a small entrepreneurial company, separate one role from the next. You're always going to be operating in multiple roles simultaneous. You just have to keep in mind that there's a natural tendency for the present to drive out the future. So if you're in charge of the future, as well as the present, you got to spend some time on the future. So one of the questions I ask small business owners is, when do you have time to think about the next generation of products? When do you have time to think about getting some more capital to invest in developing new and bringing new products to market? And if the answer is nights and weekends, then I get a little worried because they need to spend some time. But on the other hand, I also fully understand why the owner of a small business is going to be involved in day-to-day operations, because that's his livelihood. And so it's his money, for example, or her money, and he wants to make sure that it's done right. It's a real challenge for small businesses, and they have to be much more flexible. They operate at, some of them operate across 3 levels simultaneous. And that's the real challenge. And at some point, have you heard the term "kill the founder"? At some point, as a small company grows and the founder of the company is so wedded to the technology or how they used to do business that if you're going to continue to grow, you're going to have to replace the founder with somebody from the outside because they can't make the transition. And that's always very difficult because it's been their baby. They invented it. They brought it to market, and they want to keep their hands on it. Okay?
So, good morning. My name is Nicholas Bogdan, and I do some of the strategic level planning at the VA for new IT systems. I'm just kind of curious. You mentioned earlier you were doing some new work with the VA. What exactly are you doing with them?
I'm providing some advice to one of the contractors in the VBA side in terms of improving the quality of the claims processing procedures. I also provided some insight into the Secretary's new concept of the regions that he's envisioning. But it's moving slow, the process. You know that. The VA is not known for being agile.
No, they're not.
And if anything, they should be agile now because they're under attack by everybody.
That's very true.
And the issue is it's a real challenge because what they really need is they need to make some changes so they don't drive out the good people that are left. Because all we hear about are the bad people. We don't hear about all the good things they do.
You're right. So I guess then my next question is, like, what are your thoughts on when when a large organization like the VA is doing is doing strategic level planning, that may take, whatever the plans are may take, 2, 3, 5, maybe plus years to fully implement. But then taking into consideration how quickly technology is changing today, where a new technology that could come out, within 1 to 2 years that would make what we're trying to implement obsolete. Well, what's your take on, kind of that challenge?
Well, let's think about what's the difference between the Generation Y or Generation Z coming back from the war front that have injuries that are not going to mature for, let's say, 10 or 15 years, and what's the traditional way of treating those versus what's a new technical way? Let's just take PTSD.
Sure.
I'm not sure we're ever going to have enough social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists to be able to treat that. Is there a new way that we could do that electronically? Is there any? And who's working on that? Who goes to bed at night worried about a new technical breakthrough to deal with large numbers of people who may not be experiencing the problem now, but it may mature as they get older in terms of those issues. And so where's the advanced development group in the VA that's worried about those kinds of issues? We've got people that are worried about treating it now, and that's fine. But I'm looking at people like you who are saying, okay, what's likely to happen 15 years from now when this crowd becomes 45 or 50 or 60 or whatever, and what are we going to do about that? Well, what can we do about that? Is there some alternative way? Or do we just wait and I guess one of the hope is not a strategy in terms of that. And so the issue is, even if you don't have the answer, there should at least be a small strategic planning cell that's thinking about those kinds of issues longer term. I asked an interesting question one day of the superintendent at West Point. I said, if the country's facing east towards China, how come you guys aren't teaching? This was before they were teaching Chinese. They were teaching Portuguese. I said, when are you going to change languages, etc.? And it was interesting. I said, if you're producing the generals of 2025, what are you going to do different now that's going to cause them to be different in 2025? And I didn't get a very good answer. And I didn't expect one. And so the question is, who in the VA is worried about next generation kinds of issues that are going to be emerging, and how can we best treat those? And that's in it. I don't have any problem with the IG looking at today's crisis, but I'm interested in where are you guys that are looking at the future, and don't need a lot of you, but I need the right numbers of you thinking about those kinds of issues.
Okay, interesting.
And that's what I don't see. I see people putting out today's fire.
I got you.
Okay.
Okay.
I don't know if that helps. Now, we've got money coming in, right?
Yes.
So the question is, when are we going to declare something we're not going to treat? When's the last time we killed a program in the VA to fund a different program?
It's been a while. I haven't been there. I've only been there for a little over a year, so I haven't seen any programs killed since my time there.
No, we keep adding programs. And the problem is you got all those congressmen who's then become sponsors of programs, and they don't want to kill anything. So it becomes difficult in terms of that.
Okay. So then, just out of curiosity, you said you're doing some consulting stuff for folks in the VA. Is that related to implementing new technologies for that the processing system that you mentioned?
I think part of the VA is trying to go after ISO 9000, which is designed to improve their quality on claims processing. That's a little bit different than I think the VHA, which is going after trying to come up with improved healthcare in terms of delivery systems. And I don't know enough about the IT portion or the technical portion of the VA to be able to tell you what they're looking at. I know the digitization of records is high on their list, but I don't know where they are with that particular project.
Okay, interesting. All right, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Good luck.
Hi, Dr. Clement. I am wearing pants to start with. I just wanted to let you know that because we could be wearing anything over Skype. I wanted to hear you elaborate more on moving from time compression into a non-time compression mode, moving from not specifically from a time of war to a time of peace, but when you look at fast growth companies, Facebook, Google, AOL, my own, I had a small chain of battery stores. And as those companies grow, one of the things you mentioned is at some point the founder's got to go. And I agree with that wholeheartedly. Is there a mode in which the founder doesn't have to go? At every business model I've experienced, the founder does always have to go, whether it's including war times, going from war to peace. The people who are doing the action in time compression are no longer suitable for performing the action in a time of non-time compression, as it were. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think sometimes I've seen founders or owners be able to mature and take on a new role in terms of the company. So a company goes through cycles. I mean, it goes through startup and then it goes through maturity, and you're constantly developing new products and new service offerings. And I've seen bosses step up and say, "Not my job to be running today's operation. I've got somebody to do that. It's my job to be looking at the next generation of products or services, and that's what I'm particularly good at." And so they've been able to continue to do that. I've also seen companies where they've been unable to make the move from, let's say, for example, government products to commercial products with their technology, and because they've been so wedded to what they did in the government side, they couldn't see the potential application. I don't see that as much a time issue. In fact, one of the interesting things is that you're all asking a lot of questions about time. I'm much more interested in what's the work, and the work varies from a startup to a mature industry. The work varies by a high-tech company that's turning where the technology is driving change dramatically, and where the customer is demanding change. So I just finished a project with Office Depot, pretty staid retail operation, right? Well, guess what? The customer now used to be the customer shopped in retail stores only. Well, now the customer shops online, in the retail, and through the catalog. So the channels have merged, and in fact, if the company's going to survive, it had to understand that you have to think multi-channel. You can't just think of your retail channel. So if you go into an Office Depot store to buy a product and they don't have it, you should never leave that store, right? Why can't they electronically sell it to you and deliver it the next day? The technology's there. They have the e-commerce capability. It's just a different mindset. And guess what? We pay them for what they sell. Well, we have to change the way we pay people in terms of, so the management systems have to reinforce desired behavior. I'll give you a short story. I was working with Pepsi a number of years ago, and Pepsi makes more money on a 20-ounce bottle in a vending machine than they do on a 12-pack or a case. Well, we couldn't figure out why the drivers, when they were delivering Pepsis, weren't filling the vending machines. And when we got out and looked at what was happening, we found out that we pay them for volume. It takes longer to fill a vending machine than it does to drop 24 cases at a gas station. So the whole notion was that the compensation people had never been out in the field to see what behavior we wanted to reinforce. And so we simply broke the vending machine away from the volume and changed the whole pay process. So the issue is all of the management systems in the company need to reinforce desired behavior. And if desired behavior changes at the front line, then the systems have to change consistent with that. But when's the last time you think a headquarters person was out in the field doing any real field work? A lot of them stay back in headquarters and they think they know what's going on, but in fact they don't. When we were working at Rio Tinto, we didn't hire anybody that didn't mine it or sell it. So if you were going into an HR job or a finance job or an audit job, it didn't matter. You were going to go out and dig it out of the ground or sell it. That's a mining company. Those are the core businesses. And it made life a whole lot different from headquarters because they understood the core business. But how many times do you think people at headquarters understand the core business, especially in today's fast-changing world? They don't. And so as a result, they sometimes come up with dumb policies. Now, I know none of you work for companies that have dumb policies. But that's how dumb policies get created. It's the problem at the middle and top. They don't understand what the work is at the front line. So instead of looking strictly at time, I look at what's the work? What do you want me to do? To what quality standard and what profit incentive, and how fast do I have to do that in terms of turnover? That's, to me, is much more critical than whether it's a 1 year, 2 year, or 5 year.
Yeah, I guess maybe I did focus too much on time. I guess you could, if you replace the scope of work in my question with, so you get an innovator, you've got someone who works for the company like Steve Case, who helps to innovate and develop a product. He gets to the point where the company is large. He's not capable, doesn't necessarily have the right skills, doesn't necessarily have the interest in managing a multinational corporation like AOL became. So, and time again, I see that. I can't come up with a positive example in which someone has grown with the company and has taken on, well, I guess Jeff Bezos or Bezos or however you want to say it, maybe the only example I can come up with. Every other high-tech company leader has not gracefully transitioned into the long-term maintenance role. And
let me give you a low-tech example. Rio Tinto, mining company, $100 billion worldwide. We had a geologist who was very good at finding ore bodies. He just had the ability to sniff them out and find them. Well, guess what? In order to get promoted as a geologist, what happens? You have to become the lead geologist, right? And lead the geology department. He wasn't very good at leading anybody. He was very good at finding things. The CEO said, I'm not going to put him in charge of the geology department. I'm going to let him go out and find ore bodies. And I'm going to promote him to an independent contributor level at a very high level. And he doesn't have any subordinates to worry about. He just goes out and finds ore bodies. So he was very successful, never ran the geology department because he would have probably screwed it all up. But he continued to go out and find ore bodies for the company. And that CEO recognized that not everybody, not all innovators or entrepreneurs are good at managing things. And so keep them good at what they're doing. If that means changing the structure, change the structure. Create roles at a high level where they can do that kind of work. Let them innovate.
Sure. But I think as a company grows, that was a large mining company, right? And so that's a person moving within the large mining company. I get it completely. But when you're talking about a small company trying to get to big company, and small company has, medium-sized people who are medium-sized scope people, level 3 people.
Right.
That getting those people bumped up, I perceive that the growth pattern more as a rebirth pattern, constant rebirth as they're reborn and re-engineered with people who can do the higher level thinking. I don't know.
No, that's a good question because here's another example. I've got a client who the owner is very good at coming up with business ideas, but not very good at running things. He had to hire a manager to run things, and he continues to focus on growing the business. But it took him to acknowledge the fact that he's not very good at running things. And so he had to bring on a person that would manage the company. And he continued to do what he did best, which was to come up with new business ideas. And that was a level 3 business growing to level 4, now soon to become level 5. And the worst thing we needed to do with that was have him in charge of all the people, because he's not a people person.
Exactly.
That's always a good challenge.
Thanks.
Good put you.
Okay.
Good morning. I think you touched. I think you touched on this a little bit when you were talking to Jason there. But when you come into a company and you identify that a CEO isn't doing the CEO's type work, or a general isn't doing their general work, what type of actions or strategies or techniques do you use to kind of shake them up so they can identify that they themselves are not doing what they should be doing, and then I guess realign them so they're doing the type of work they should be doing?
Well, that's it's an interesting challenge. If the CEO brings you in and he thinks he's doing CEO work, then you have to help him discover. Otherwise, he will shoot you won't be there very long doing your work.
Sure.
So one of the things I do is I simply point out here's the generic kind of work that a CEO should be doing, and I try to make it positive and say, okay, one of the things you're supposed to be doing is thinking about the culture, thinking about the future. How much time do you have to be able to do that? And I might look at his in basket and say, most of the day you spend in meetings. How many of these meetings do you really have to be at versus how much time can we free up so that you can start thinking about dealing with uncertainty and strategic options, et cetera, that you should be thinking at? And I kind of just show them some things. And I tell them some examples. For example, at Whirlpool, the guy in charge of the microwave, I asked him, I said, when do you think about new microwave strategies? He said, on the way to work every day. I said, well, no wonder your microwaves are useless. You need to have a time to be able to do that. So you have to help them see that and say, look, one of your key tasks is talent development. And I've learned this technique. I tell the senior levels, you're all wonderful. Let's work on the next generation. Because if you try to tell senior level people in the company that they're the problem, you're going to have trouble. So I just tell them, let's talk about the next generation. What kinds of skills, experiences, development moves do they need to get to your level? And they're much more willing to entertain that. And guess what? They soon discover that they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing when you free them up. But it's more of an art than it is a science. But I can tell you, if you go in and tell the CEO the problem is you can do that if you're the #1 consultant name in the world.
Right.
And you don't need any business.
Have you ever had, in personal experience, where you went in and the person just was so set in their ways, or they just were shooting the messenger, so to speak, and you just couldn't help them?
Yep. And I've had to leave companies. I've just said I can't fix the problem because the problem is the boss.
Sure.
And I've had a chairman call me to go into a company. I said, unless you're willing as the board to replace the boss, there's nothing I can do. Because he's not willing to do his work. He's doing everybody else's work, and all your best people are leaving.
Yeah.
And unless they're willing to do that, so I've walked away from some companies because the problem is you can't fix it.
Sure. All right. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, I think you just inadvertently answered my question. Our company, we're going through a merger, and with our sister company in South Carolina, and the merger has led to so much disdain and fear in our company. Have you ever saw a company that actually came back culturally from being from fearful to hopeful? Like, I just want to know if there's any hope for my company's culture at this moment. It went from a family type organization now to where people are so scared for their jobs and they don't know what to do. So I'm just trying to figure out culturally what could happen.
Well, that's an interesting question. I just went through Office Depot merging with Office Max, and then Staples just bought both of them out, and we moved people from Chicago to Florida. Now they're moving to Massachusetts, and you're right. There's a tremendous amount of stress. What companies need to do is they need to understand and have a change strategy and a human capital strategy, recognizing that people are worried about their job, and unless they're willing to address that issue, they're not going to get the productivity out of them that they want. And typically, they under-resource that issue. They just don't understand that at the end of the day, there's a human being that sits in that job and is worried about what's going to happen to me, especially in today's economy. So to the extent that they can, as quickly as possible, allay people's fears and say, hey, these jobs are going to stay, these jobs are probably going to merge, and there's other opportunities, you're going to have people worried about survival as opposed to worried about making the merger work. And it's going to take that much longer.
Exactly. We're finding actually that people are not giving, the communication is just not there anymore. They're not giving information to the South Carolina site as readily because they're so scared for their job. So
Yeah.
we're having an implementation of a new system, and the talks are just not occurring. So,
No, because they by hoarding the data, they may think they can keep their job, right?
exactly.
And it's hard to blame them. I mean, it would be nice if someone came back and gave them a strategy and said, here's what's going to happen, and we're not going to be, we're going to find work for you. It may not be in the same area, but we're going to find work for you, but we need you to participate in this merger. And then a lot depends on whether or not the company wants to simply save money in the merger. Mergers are not necessarily the most, they get efficiencies, but they lose effectiveness when they're getting efficiencies.
That's very true. Well, thank
And
you
it
so
takes
much.
a while. Okay.
Hi, good morning. So, like, excuse me. My question is kind of getting back to what you were saying earlier about the disconnect between executives and what's really going on at the lower levels, right? So my question is, we have a lot of government organizations that have these strategic plans, these 5-year strategic plans. How well do you feel like those are actually embraced and communicated and executed on? And what are some of the best practices that you've seen for executives and middle management to have better ground truth and better communication conduits?
Okay, good question. I don't want to come across as cynical, but most 5-year plans are 5 times 1. All they do is extrapolate from this year's plan to over the next 5 years. So I don't see very many 5-year plans that are worth a hoot at all. Most of them are probably pretty flaky. One of the critical tasks of the manager at succeeding levels is to do his own planning. Some companies offload that task to a strategic planning cell as opposed to them doing their own work. They have to have time to think about that. So how do you get beyond 1 year, a 1-year plan? Well, you have to be looking at options. What are my options if this happens or that happens in terms of, so the kind of thinking at level 3, which is a director level in most companies, in the military, that's a battalion commander. In the VA, that would be probably a GS 11, 12, 13. Most government agencies. Well, they should be asking, here's my plan. My plan is simply to take me from where I am to where I want to be. Now, as I look down that plan, what could go wrong? What's the possibility? So, for example, at Pepsi, I would ask the sales manager, what's the risk if Coke drops their price? What are you going to do? And we would require them to have options and go through the thought process of an option. And that option then would go into having some alternative plans at the higher level. So you don't have just one plan, but you have, here's what I'd like to happen, but here's some alternatives in the event that unforeseen circumstances occur, which they always do. So most plans are the hole-in-one golf, right? And when you don't get the hole-in-one, you got a crisis. And so that's what leads to crisis management as opposed to people thinking out what could happen. So at the higher levels, that's not as much, that's not easy work because it's nebulous, it's uncertain. And so they would much rather just say, well, I'm going to just extrapolate. Sales are going to continue to climb, as opposed to saying, well, I'm going to introduce new products or this is going to happen with a competitor, et cetera. So strategic planning requires strategic thinking before they do the planning. And how much of the mid-level people are really doing thinking, strategic thinking? Most, as I said, most of the time I see mid-level people in meetings all day long, and they don't have time to be thinking about anything. And so a 5-year plan is okay. How do you know it's not 5 times 1? And what's the best practice? And one of the ways is that I need to be able to share my plan and my limits with my subordinates, so they have freedom to go to the extent of my limits, not just what I assign them. I don't want to curtail them. I want them to operate to the full extent of my limits. But I can't do that without setting the context of how my work fits into the larger framework of the company in terms of that. So that has to be shared by mid-level managers all the way on down. So it's important. It's a cascading event. We don't do a very good job of it.
So, based on what you said, do you feel like a lot of these 5-year plans, I mean, as you said, they're not worth a hoot, right? I mean, do you feel like they're not really strategic in age? Do you feel like that term is tossed around too loosely?
Yep, I think it's all tactical. It's 5 times 1.
Okay.
This year is a tactical operation, and you just extrapolate out as opposed to really looking at strategically thinking about what could happen. What are the alternatives? Yeah. And I think that's a real problem.
Roger that. Okay.
Okay. Sorry, I can't help you.
No, you did help. That was
Life is frustrating, right?
yeah. Oh, yeah. Very much so. All right.
You know, this would be great. It would be a great place to work if it weren't for all these people. Don't know what they're doing. Okay.
I agree. Thanks.
Good morning.
Morning.
To take a term out of Dr. Ivanov, this may be controversial, but so in your research about time span and time compression in war zones, you're putting a lot of onus on the generals and the colonels that aren't doing their level of work. They're operating at lower levels than they should be. My question is, in your research, what variables did you look at? Again, you're putting a lot of onus on the individual, but how much onus is on the upper echelon? So what I mean by that is, in your paper you say in the early stages of the war on terrorism. Well, the war on terrorism, that term, it's really just a marketing term. There's no strategic plan for war on terrorism. You can't go to the shelf and say, okay, well, if we do X, Y, and Z, this is going to eliminate terrorism. It's really just a way for the government to be able to spend money. And the same is true for the Iraq campaign and the Afghanistan campaign. In Iraq in 2003, when we first went in, the plan was, okay, go capture the capital, and then what? There's no plan after that initial year, which actually turned into only a couple months. And then, as the war progressed in Iraq, the entire campaign changed. You had the awakening in 2007, and just different things changed. So you can't look further than the 2 or 3 years that you're there. And then my last point or question, I guess, is you state that the 2-star general that's supposed to be operating at the level 5, when he's back in garrison, he's looking, at the 5-year plan. But then when we put him into that war zone, we just give him a base and say, okay, your job is to secure this base and create white space. Well, that's not the work. We're not affording that general the opportunity to do level 5 work. So I guess my overarching question is, what variables did you look at in your research as to why these people aren't doing the correct level of work?
Well, interesting. I didn't start off to do research about time compression. I was interviewing people in the Pentagon in terms of what their work was. And in the conversation, they simply told me what they had been doing in wartime versus what they were doing currently in the peacetime environment. And I found an interesting observation. I was simply observing differences between what they said they did, the work that they were doing in the 2 different theaters. And since I happened to have the same person, who operated in the two different theaters, it allowed me to make some interesting observations. I was, at the time, not even interested in whether there was such a concept of time compression. I just observed that the two-star in the Pentagon, who was operating on a 5 or 7 year budget cycle, when he was in theater in Iraq, was pacifying local population group, handing out money, doing certain kinds of things. And that changed as the war situation changed in terms of that. What was puzzling about that was asking the question, well, who's got the strategy, the longer term strategy for the particular country? I don't want to make you all depressed, but I didn't get a warm, fuzzy feeling that the civilians knew what was going on and they had a strategy in terms of that. Do you think we have a strategy now for the Middle East?
No. It's very clear that we don't.
We seem to be firefighters. We go in and put out a fire, and then guess what? Another fire pops up somewhere else. We don't seem to have a coherent. And whose work is it to do that?
Exactly, and I guess that's my point is, your paper and kind of what you're saying, you're putting a lot of onus on that two-star general. Well, much like everybody in the military, that two-star general gets told where to go. It's the four-star general, it's the Department of State, it's the executive branch, it's Congress that tells, hey, this is the plan. And
right.
Absent that, we're not allowing those generals or those colonels to do the appropriate level of work. So, who's really at fault here? I don't think it's the two-star generals.
No, it's not. It's not the two-star. That should be the four-star who's been looking at the theater. I do have a different example. I happened to spend a lot of time with a general called Max Thurman before he went to South America in terms of the Panama invasion. And what General Thurman did was he had some people looking at all the various countries in South America, anticipating what could possibly go wrong with these countries. What's the nature of their economy? What's the nature of the population? How old is the population? What are some problems, and what are some hot spots? And so he was looking out beyond simply a short-term crisis, but looking at the whole sector of the world and asking those longer-term kinds of questions. Then he would step back and say, what kinds of ambassadors do I need? What kinds of military attachés do I need in which country? And what kind of background do they need? I think maybe Dave Petraeus was as close to doing that as anybody in terms of that. I worry that we don't have anybody like that now that's thinking at that same level, but I haven't been involved in that at the time.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and it comes down to the whole marketing campaign of war on terrorism. If you're a government agency and you're not doing anything with war on terrorism, you have very little money. So naturally, all those agencies shift to support the war on terrorism to get money, and nobody's looking at those 10-year issues. That's where Yemen came from. That's why Syria is the way that it is. Nobody was looking at that stuff.
Remember now, when we deployed robots, we took the typical development of a robot or a new weapon system or a new system goes to the R&D community, and it takes them 10 years to get anything out. Right. We took the money away, gave it to some private offline group of people, and we were able to develop and field a robot within 6 months. And of course, the R&D community got all upset because they said we were ripping off their money. Well, what we were doing was we were saying we didn't have 10 years time. We had to speed up the process, and the current bureaucratic system wasn't capable of doing that. And so the principle there is that if you want rapid development, then you don't give it necessarily to the people who do evolutionary development. You give it to a new group of people to be able to do that. And of course, that irritates the evolutionary people because they all are looking for money.
Right.
And so, but that's to your point, is making some adjustments to that.
Right.
But I agree with you in terms of the whole notion of time and whose work is it to be looking at that.
All right. Thank you.
Okay.
One more question.
Oh, you got another question? Okay.
Absolutely. So one of the critics of Deming is that his work has predominantly been culture specific. the same applies to Jax. People look at it and say that it's for the small environment, not for the large environment. And I mean, there's lots of different critical aspects to the culture-centric argument on that. One of the questions I have is it possible that the way that you guys are scoping work or this time compression is a culture-centric type environment that's happening because now you're speeding up timelines and stuff in a wartime environment. So that culture is actually creating something there that may or may not be successful when we're talking about this.
Yeah, I think. Look, I look at Dr. Jackson. I look at Dr. Deming. I look at their concepts as these are working hypotheses, working principles that need to be tailored or adjusted to constantly changing situations. This is not a Bible. This is a set of working principles that seem to make sense. I use the principles that make sense when they make sense, and if they don't, I'm perfectly willing to make some adjustments in terms of those issues. I have concluded, for example, after working in Europe, that you cannot work in Europe without a country manager. Each of those countries are so fundamentally different that if you try to go in with a pan-European sales force, you're going to have trouble. The French don't like the Germans, who don't like the Brits, etc., and you just have to acknowledge that. And I've watched several companies go in and get rid of the country manager, and they've had a disaster. I call the country manager the cultural manager. He or she is in charge of the culture. So there are cultural differences that occur. In Latin America, they're much more willing to have me make assessments of their people than they are in America. American managers want to make the judgments themselves. They don't want an outsider doing it. So there are significant cultural differences that have to be, and there's significant situational differences. So the concepts and principles you're learning are simply concepts and principles. You tailor them when they make sense. I don't think anything we're doing intuitively good managers haven't been doing for a long time. I think what's different was I think Jax put some things together and Deming put some things together. But the key to Toyota is this culture. I mean, Toyota took years to develop a culture of quality. You can take Deming and try to instill it in an American company and it won't work until you get the culture right. In terms of those things, you can do the same thing with Jax in terms of I could take time horizon and go in and get overwhelmed with time horizon and lose the forest for the trees with a client, especially in the high tech world. So I don't worry too much about them. Take what's right and seems to make sense and tailor it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay.
Dr. Clement, thank you so much for joining us. Again, Thank you for writing this book, and I hope another book is coming up shortly. That's a challenge.
Okay, and thanks for the group there, and they're in charge of the future, so I hope that they learn a lot so they can go back and make all these companies effective and efficient.
Yes, and remember, we have at least 2 consultants to invite. With that, let's applaud Dr. Clement. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much.
And good luck in writing books and in your business.
Okay. Good luck. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Dr. Clement. Bye-bye.